Chatham House has just launched its Critical Minerals Initiative, tackling the growing geopolitical scramble for resources like lithium, cobalt, and rare earth minerals, vital for clean energy, electric vehicles, and defense. But supply chains are shaky and a few players still dominate. Christopher Vandome, who heads the initiative, joins us now. Hi, Chris.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on again, and greetings from Addis.
So, Chris, why this push now? What's changed to make critical minerals a top priority for Chatham House?
So, critical minerals has obviously become a bit of a buzzword in recent years, and everyone has been kind of really, interested in various elements of it, from the need for resources to power a green energy transition, all the way through to the requirement for small elements. Or small volumes of some of these minerals and metals to power defense industries. The conversations around what we decide to be strategic has been going on for quite some time now, for kind of the last 10, 15 years, particularly driven by national industrialization strategy. Countries within the European Union itself, in Asia, Japan, South Korea, others have been identifying what is really important for their industrialization, for their manufacturing, and so on, and where is the vulnerability within some of those supply chains. Now, this has really come to the fore in the last couple of years, where the intensity on concentration of processing of metals and minerals in China has given rise to the identification of this as a supply chain vulnerability. So much is being produced in China and processed in China that it's hugely vulnerable for countries who are dependent on this. And the rise of Chinese export controls, the ability of them to be able to cut off supply for some of these metals and minerals, has really given rise to this idea that this is critical. Now, what's really interesting about this area is that criticality is defined in multiple ways. Now, one of those is international and by consumer countries who view criticality as what is it that, for our modern economies, in terms of, green energy transition, in terms of digitalization, requirements for AI and AI data centers, as well as for defense utilization. What are the elements that go into this? What are the inputs, and where are the vulnerabilities within that? So what do we need to call critical, and therefore to give this kind of political labeling to? And another area is around, well, what's really important for producing countries? So particularly in Latin America and in Africa, a whole other swathe of metals and minerals are being defined as critical because they're really important for those national economies. And then you've got some really interesting cases of people who sort of sit in between. They both are producers and users, and they sit in supply chains in a sort of different way, and that would be more like Canada and Australia. So within this greater space, yes, these things are critical because of their need for, like I say, energy transition and so on. But at the same time, it's a really geopolitical issue. And that's where our critical mineral initiative steps in, is that this isn't just about, how much of this stuff we need. And ultimately, we're going to need a lot more of it. The challenge is that no single country is endowed with all of the metals and minerals that it needs for its own energy transition, for its own security, or for the digitalization of its own economy. There is a need for countries to work together. One of the reasons why we as Chatham House are really stepping up our engagement on this and collating the work that we've been doing for several years around it is that geopolitical competition around these supply chains is really intensifying, not least because we are ascribing a political version of criticality to supply chains, upon which for the last decade or 2 decades, we've really become used to China providing, because China was subsidizing the processing part of these supply chains. So after production or after kind of mineral extraction, a lot of material goes to China for processing. Now, if you look back 20 years, China had several things. It had a mineral endowment. It had very cheap labor and it had large amounts of cheap labor. And it also had an industrial policy based around manufacturing and the exporting of manufactured goods that meant that they were able to can bring all of this together. And the missing link in that chain was the processing part. So they invested heavily through government subsidization into that processing space. And the rest of the world became used to it. We were all in the market for cheaper and cheaper products and cheaper processed materials for input into our own products. This led to a position where we now are, where we're so reliant on China that it's become a point of national interest and geopolitical importance that we try and diversify away from that. And what we're seeing is a trade-off between this availability of cheap material versus national resilience in our supply chains. And that gives rise to this really big and important political question, which is, to what extent are other countries prepared to step in and foot the bill for closing that gap? You know, we're all becoming more resource nationalistic, whether it be Europe, America, China, Japan, Australia, and of course, producing countries in Africa and in Latin America. And the question is, that resource nationalism is going to come at a cost, and who is going to be able to pay that bill?
Well, this critical mineral scramble has been building for a while and intensified due to the tension between China and the Trump administration. With the recent Trump deal, is there now less pressure on Western governments to diversify?
I think it buys time. It's going to be unrealistic to expect that any other country is going to be able to overtake China, particularly in the midterm, as a major processor of critical minerals. These projects are going to take at least a decade to come online, particularly in the extraction phase. If you look at where kind of new centers of processing are going to occur, you know, it could be within Europe or the US. It could be within the Gulf states, where you have both the availability of capital, where they're trying to invest oil rent, as well as the political will, because, you know, again, they're looking to diversify their economies away from hydrocarbons. They've got the available resources and they've got a long-term vision, and are looking at what happened in the last 20 years in China of, okay, you know, the Chinese subsidized this and then they got themselves into a really strategic position. We have the means to be able to subsidize and see if we can also get ourselves into that strategic position. So to some extent, you know, this is longer term, and what we've got on the table immediately, you know, it takes the sting out of the trade war, but it doesn't necessarily, you know, shift the market in the longer term. The other part of it, which I think is quite interesting, is it's, you know, the creation of China's dominance in this space was, like I said, it was about domestic manufacturing. It was about the domestic economy, and it was about going out into the world and finding resources that could then fuel what was going on at home. Now, there's a couple of theories around this. One is that says, okay, well, China, you know, from the outset identified this as a space as being, this is going to be the next oil, and we want to position ourselves strategically and have a hold on this. The other, which I think is, you know, as valid, if not more valid, is that it was about that domestic economic growth that then they now find themselves in a position where they do have a controlling position within markets for various elements, including rare earth elements and so on, and are now able to manipulate that and weaponize it in their trade discussions with other countries. And that's what's particularly interesting, because then it's a kind of, well, what came first? You know, was it the fact that China got itself into this position and then said, well, now we're here, we're going to manipulate the market and we're going to replace export controls so that we can kind of use this to our geopolitical advantage? Or was it a case that it always wanted to do this? Now, when we look at that relationship with the US and the rise of this kind of tit for tat exchange that we've seen this year, it's sort of, it's sort of mixed. So prior to the trade war with the US this year, China had imposed export controls, particularly in its near abroad, on Japan and on South Korea. But the identification of this vulnerability by the European Union, by the United States, has sort of then fueled the Chinese acknowledgement that, yes, this is a lever over which that we have control within some of these trade wars. And so you can see this tit for tat exchange between the US and China. US moves on tariffs, China imposes more restrictions, and so on. So, it's both part of their own kind of strategy and saying, okay, yes, we can use this, but it's also in response to the competition with the United States, in which they've been able to say, okay, it's the United States themselves who are saying this is a vulnerability and this is a potential lever for us, so let's use it.
Well, there's always this danger for Africa that it becomes a pawn in this great power play. Some African countries have signed deals like the one with the DRC, which is a peace for minerals kind of deal. So how do you think African countries should navigate this?
It's really interesting because a lot of this raw material is in Africa and will come from Africa. African countries have a desire to move up the value chain. They don't want to be exporting raw material. They want to be exporting processed material. In a lot of cases, that processing costs a lot of money. And like I said, in the case of China, it was quite heavily subsidized in order to be able to then support domestic manufacturing. So those ingredients of a labor pool, a skill set around processing, and then labor and skills in manufacturing. You need all of these ingredients in order to be able to kind of develop large scale, processing industries that can supply a readily available offtake. Manufacturers who are there ready to take the materials off. You also need energy and a huge amount of electricity in order to do the processing. So Africa sits at an interesting position in that it does have a lot of resources, but there aren't that many places where you could pull together all of the other ingredients. So we're seeing a sort of diversion or kind of disengagement between continental aspirations, where there's a sort of Pan-Africanist desire for value addition, and the way in which that's communicated, particularly through the African mining vision, but then also the green mineral strategy of the AMDC and African Development Bank and others. Also in the G20, in the way in which the South Africans have been sort of convening regional mining ministers around priorities, and particularly around exploration, but also around the subject of value addition. You've also got kind of deals between DRC and Zambia around electric vehicle battery manufacture, which are quite slowly progressing. But against this kind of regional outlook, you've also got national priorities. And so some countries are deciding to go it alone or work with those immediately around them. So, Africa, in terms of that kind of what's being stated by the continent, is kind of separating. That being said, there are some materials on the continent that are only found here. So, of course, cobalt from the DRC is the one that everybody points their finger to. And we've seen export controls by the Congolese government and then subsequently lifted. Again, how do you benefit when you're the global source for something that's really, really significant? If the price is too low, then huge amounts are produced and they leave the country, and then you don't get the taxes and royalties off that. You would put in place export controls, and then rather than people being incentivized to come and work around value addition in country, what we've actually seen is more investment going into substitutability rather than into value addition on the continent. And so that's going to be one of the key issues going forward, is how does Africa place itself in this? It has a right to enshrine its own economic sovereignty. Clearly, it's in everybody's interest. And if you look at the UN panel on critical minerals, it's very strong about the protection of producing countries in developing nations, the importance of critical minerals potentially as a new resource boom that can drive development. But it's not just the resources, and it's a mixture of, yes, you need the resources, but you also need the energy, you need the infrastructure, you need to develop the skill sets, and you also need a stable policy environment and a stable regulatory environment to encourage people onto the continent to come and do the processing here rather than doing it elsewhere. And that's going to be one of the, that's a big political decision for outsiders to make. Do we want to subsidize and work with producers on the African continent in order to work on upscaling processing and work with local partners in developing those supply chains?
So what about South Africa, given its mineral wealth and strategic location? How is it being courted, or is it currently being overlooked in partnerships?
Yeah, South Africa is really important, particularly for manganese, especially for platinum. It's the world's largest producer of platinum. It's very important for chromium. For ferrochromes. And so South Africa is a really important part of this conversation. But South Africa sort of exemplifies this tension between criticality in terms of its requirement for a clean energy transition and the responsible sourcing of material for supporting green energy, and that material, living up to those standards of green energy production. So, working with countries in a way that is, towards these sustainable goals, versus from the South African perspective of what is actually critical for South Africa, not just for a global transition. And so the inclusion of coal as a critical mineral for South Africa has been a bit of a sticking point with its relationships with some of the international community. And so you'll see some of the partnerships that have been agreed between UK, EU, and South Africa kind of fudge the words a little bit because of this recognition that, yes, you've got some of the material that's really important, but yes, at the same time, you're also viewing coal as a critical mineral. And in the case of South Africa, coal is critical. It's so important for electricity generation, and it's so important for employment. So South Africa occupies a really interesting space in this conversation, both as a kind of host of, a mineral endowment that the world does want and wants more of for an energy transition, but then also because of the way in which South Africa and its national interests define criticality. The hosting of the G20 is actually a really important moment for South Africa to be able to articulate some of these aspirations and also show that this isn't just a unitary, South African perspective, but that it is at one with partners across the continent of putting forward this sentiment, and is very involved in a lot of the kind of international groups that are working on this, including, as I said, the UN panel on critical minerals and the role that South Africa played within that.
You've noted the long lead times for developing alternative supply chains. Are we realistically looking at a whole decade before other countries can match China's dominance?
Yeah, and possibly longer. We've been talking about critical minerals for a number of years now, and there's always been this gap between the rhetoric and the investment. What I think is really significant of what the US has done under the Trump administration is match that rhetoric with actual investment, and work with partners who have both the political will and the available capital. So if you look at the way in which the US is working, they've got deals with Saudi Arabia for the provision of critical minerals. They have deals with Qatar. They have deals with UAE. And so they've finally started moving in terms of putting money behind some of these, some of this rhetoric. So the deal with Australia that was signed recently is a really kind of important point on that, in that it was the first sort of kind of major deal signed with another sort of major security partner. And the tour across Asia, clearly very well orchestrated, that deals with Cambodia, Malaysia, Vietnam, all signed, and Japan, all signed in the run-up to the meeting with Xi Jinping, to say, yes, you can use, your rare earth element export restrictions against us. But look, we're building these partnerships across your backyard, and, and we're prepared to actually put money into this, and to change. And the other thing that the Americans are doing, is, it's working with the private sector, but acknowledging where the some of the challenges exist. So, like I said, the idea of criticality doesn't come from their prices, doesn't really come from their geological availability. There's a lot of this stuff all over the place, although not necessarily in the quantities that make it commercially viable to exploit. But it's more about the location of the processing that has been the big challenge. But the criticality that is ascribed to some of these materials, particularly where it comes to defense, these are very small amounts that are needed, of materials that don't cost a huge amount of money. And so part of the problem is that there hasn't been the price incentive for investors to create new operations and so on. And so one of the things that the Americans have been doing is putting in place price floors. So with MP Metals in America, as well as within some of the Asian deals that were signed, you see this minimum price offtake agreement to say, okay, let's solve the problem of low prices being the issue here, and low prices being, making it uncommercially viable to do this. We're going to come in and we will financially support a minimum price that just puts in place that long-term confidence for the companies to be able to produce. So, that's where we've seen the big shift in the last 6 months or so, and particularly in the last few weeks from the Americans, is, addressing some of these market failures with genuine capital investment.
Chris Vandome from Chatham House, thanks so much for speaking to us.
Thank you so much.